Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Earth Climate Dreams, Depth Psychological Reflections in the Age of the Anthropocene. And as you know, this is a symposium that is really aimed at being able to have conversations around what I think is a really important topic. And I know many of you are drawn to this because of your own feelings, emotions, thoughts, concerns, and even the psychological implications of what's happening on our planet, particularly in what is now being called the Age of the Anthropocene. And in this session, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Jonathan Marshall, who is actually not a psychologist or a depth psychologist or Jungian, but is in fact an anthropologist. Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for spending some time with me.
A pleasure. Absolutely.
Well, it's great to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to digging into some of the aspects that have not actually been covered yet in this particular symposium. I think that you'll have some very unique views on things that we have not been able to hear before, but it doesn't mean that your views are not necessarily depth psychological, which is something that we're going to go into very shortly. So let me just read a bio for Jonathan, and then we'll jump in. Dr. Jonathan Paul Marshall is an anthropologist and senior research associate at the University of Technology, Sydney, currently researching the politics of coal use and the transition to renewables. Previously, he has worked on questions around online social life and the relationship of alchemy to the history of science. And I might just add, by the way, that Jonathan has an article in the latest edition of Depth Insights, which is a scholarly journal that is done for Depth Psychology Alliance, and you can find that at www.depthinsights.com if you'd like to read Jonathan's article, which is on alchemy. And I think that would be of interest to many people. And Jonathan is also the editor and author of a number of books, including Jung, Alchemy and History, Depth Psychology, Disorder and Climate Change, which we've heard a little bit about in the symposium, and I'm sure we'll hear more about, Environmental Change and the World's Futures, Ecologies, Ontologies and Mythologies, Disorder and the Disinformation Society, and Living on Cybermind, Categories, Communication and Control. And Jonathan, I read through those pretty quickly, but there's a really diverse range of titles there. And I think if people are interested in knowing more about those, this will definitely be written so that you can find that and look those up. But what I'd really like to jump into as we move ahead here is the title that grabbed me, of course, right up front, and I have known of your work for several years now because of this, is this book called Depth Psychology, Disorder and Climate Change. And I found a number of things that were very interesting about that, not the least of those being that the word depth psychology was in there, because of course we don't run into that so much in the mainstream. And I didn't know you, I didn't know where you were coming from, I didn't know who you were, but I knew that you were an anthropologist, and so I thought that was fascinating that that came up. So maybe we can start by talking about that a little bit. Because you are an anthropologist, I would expect you to not necessarily be focused on Jung, and yet a lot of the work that you've done in both publications and otherwise has very much been indicative of an interest in depth psychology and Jungian psychology. So can you say more about that? How did that come about?
Oh, well, basically as an anthropologist, I'm kind of interested in the kinds of things that people generally don't like talking about too much. There's sort of things like magic, irrationality, the kind of grip that symbols have upon us, because that seems very much important to daily life and to the way that people act. So I was a long time ago writing a paper about the dynamics of art. I was wanting to do something about how symbols actually moved within people and they shaped people's personality and so on. And as I was doing that, I actually encountered some writings by Jung on alchemy. And so the paper that I wrote was entirely on alchemy as an example of how these symbols work. But one of the things that struck me as I was going through all of this Jungian work on alchemy was that Jung completely left the social and the historical out of the alchemical history. So he didn't sort of think about, well, maybe we have this type of alchemy at this stage in history and this type of alchemy in this place and this time. So I wrote a detailed history of alchemy in the United Kingdom to act as a background for the work that I was supposed to do, which was to see how the alchemical symbols changed. And unfortunately, I never got around to the second part of it as life took over. But I also found Jung really interesting because, lots of people I knew wrote about Freud, but for me, Freud seemed to have a really kind of tight and almost dead approach to the unconscious, because the unconscious was sort of solely animal passions and sex drives and things like that. It was something that you had to sublimate at best. Whereas here, Jung is talking about the unconscious as a creative force, if you like, as a source of hidden wisdom within us that operated by symbols. And so therefore, you know, the obvious thing is that if you're a Jungian, when you look at a dream, you're looking for what is the dream telling you? What can the dream do to elucidate the situation you're in? Whereas with Freud, it's always kind of, well, what is the dream pointing at in terms of your childhood traumas? So Freud sort of goes down, but down to a really constricted point, whereas Jung goes up into, you know, what is this use for daily life? How does this affect us? And so, you know, again, the Jungian attitude to art and to religion is that it's not just a delusion, but it actually has the capacity to take us forward, to actually help us think about things or feel about things. And that struck me as much more realistic and much more resonating with the kind of art that I or other people did. And so I ended up being a Jungian, and I was also reading Gregory Bateson at about the same time I was reading Jung. And it struck me that there was a real, that Jung was trying to talk about systems theory in the way that Bateson was, but he just didn't have the vocabulary because, you know, in Germany in that time, you wouldn't have done. Maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But so that was where I came from. So it seemed to me that Jung was a modernist or a postmodernist in the way that Freud just wasn't. And it's interesting that, you know, I've heard that from various people that Lacan and so on was actually more interested in Jung than Freud, but that it was much more politically opportune to talk about Freud than Jung in France after the war.
Yeah.
But, you know, I don't know if that's true or not.
I don't either. But, you know, the politics often come into things. And actually, it's not surprising that you would bring that up, because I think politics also come into what we're talking about here today, which is primarily climate change and the sheer amount of issues that come up around climate change are often political. And so I think that your focus on the politics of it is a really important piece of it. Can you say a little bit more about how the politics of climate change have affected your work and what you see? I mean, you're very involved in, as we said in the bio, in the coal industry and looking at renewables, fossil fuels.
Well, look, basically it is impossible to take a non-political position on climate change. You know, if you're active, you know, if you believe that climate change is real and that it's humanly inducted, then you want to do something about it. Okay, if you don't believe, then you have all these other people who are trying to change your life. So you have to get involved in politics too. So there's no way you can be kind of objective about it, because it is essentially an existential threat. If it is real, it is an existential threat. It threatens the ways that we live. It threatens the ways that we think. It requires us to do and have a new life, if you like. And having a new life means that we have to engage in political activity, because we have to be able to persuade other people that they also need to join into this. It's not something that people can do just by themselves. Obviously, they can do useful things by themselves, and I would always encourage people to do whatever they can. But nevertheless, you have to act as an exemplar. You have to convince other people of the truth of what it is that you're doing. And also the thing is that politics is in a way a fantasy, because it is a fantasy about how we should live and how it is possible to live. And so consequently, it fits in with the kind of, with your own psychology, with the way that the symbols appeal to you or don't appeal to you, and the way that they act in you. And a lot of politics about climate change is projective politics, in that you are searching for a scapegoat whose, you know, blame makes you innocent. And that happens on both sides, or, you know, I prefer to say on many, many sides, because I don't think there is actually just two sides in the climate debate, or two sides in any debate, really. There's always multiple sides. And so because climate change is a call for us to change our lives, it is also a call for us to change our psyches. So the psyche and the politics are mutually implicated at all times. And, you know, obviously the more well-balanced you can get in your psyche, the more well-balanced you'll become in your politics. But at the same time, there's a terrible risk for people to just try and solve it at their own psychological level and not actually, if you like, take it out into the street or take it out into the state or into your own business decisions. Because that's where we live.
Yeah, yes, and I think from a cultural standpoint, it's absolutely so critical that this become more of a collective, I mean, it's already a collective dream, I guess. We are living out a story in our culture about, that includes the destruction of the planet and the human role as we enter this age of the Anthropocene, as they're calling it. And so it also needs to be solved on some level, on a collective level, even though we each have to do our own individual work. But I'm going to segue, I'm going to go ahead and say that, and then I want to segue into something.
Okay, I was just going to basically say that this is, again, another reason why Jungian psychology is useful, because Jungian psychology automatically starts with the collective unconscious. And I would argue that to a large extent, the collective unconscious is actually constructed by what you might call the collective ego, the way that we like thinking about things. And that, of course, you know, I mean, one of the great things about the concept of the Anthropocene is it says we are not individuals. We are not even humans isolated from the rest of the world. We have an impact on the world, and that impact has to be factored into what we do. We are no longer isolated individuals, whether we would like to be that or not.
Yes. Yeah, so that actually leads very well into what I was going to say, and that is that I really like that you have articulated the fact that Jungian psychology is generative, in the sense that, you know, it's always leading to something that's creative and can be transformational. And transformation is always good, even if we look at it as transformation into something that's difficult, like a descent or an initiation of sorts. Those things have to be gone through.
I would prefer to say that transformation can always be good rather than is always good, because I think there are transformations which are lethal transformations. And I think Jung talked a lot about the dangers of becoming possessed and so on by particular symbols. And I think it's good to bear that in mind. But nevertheless, even painful transformations can be good transformations, and sometimes good transformations require you to go through pain. So you always have to be able to evaluate in some ways, is this a good transformation or is it not? And the difficulty is, of course, you don't know until you've been through it, which is why sometimes it's useful to have a therapist who's had some experience. But so I wouldn't be optimistic and say that, you know, it's inevitable that we will come through this, you know, all work with everything working. I think there is the possibility that we won't. But nevertheless, unless we move and cautiously move and see what the results of our actions are when we've done them, because, you know, we won't know again until we've done them, then we have a chance of success, a good chance of success, I think. But we do have to bear in mind that there is the possibility of failure. But bearing that possibility in mind then will help us to actually achieve success, because we won't just go through saying success is inevitable. We will triumph, you know, which is, to me, is a really fascist approach to the world, and one that actually causes more problems than we have already.
Yes, it's a very non-depth psychological approach, that's for sure. And that's why I think there's such a great need for depth. And I think that I really want to say I appreciate you sort of articulating the fact that transformation is not necessarily always going to be generative, because I think that I've become so used to looking at it from a depth psychological standpoint that even death, and I say that in the symbolic sense, is often a phase that is very generative, because out of death, the death of something, comes the opportunity, the space, the energy, whatever, that's something new. However, going through that is obviously not desirable and can be very painful, as you pointed out.
And sometimes it can just end in death.
Yes. Yes, that's right. And so just to follow up on that, what you had
Yeah.
alluded to then in that same sentence, if you will, is the idea of possession, and how Jung talked about possession, how we can become so identified with one particular idea or another that we no longer differentiate ourselves from that, and therefore transformation really has a hard time taking place because there's no space for it to take place. And that's why often seeing a therapist or doing some kind of inner work allows for that space to emerge, so that you can just get a little bit of distance from that thing that you're so identified with or so possessed with, that actually then something new can happen.
Yeah, so one of the things that I sort of like to emphasize is that everything that we do has an ordering and a disordering aspect to it. So we need an ego. You can't function without an ego, right? But nevertheless, the ego is a limitation of the possible perceptions that you have. And it also has, you have particular ideas which direct what you're doing. And that is good up to a point. And then there comes a point at which you need to relax the ego and let the inner wisdom or symbols or whatever emerge from you, so that you can actually then modify your ego and become something new, or become better adapted to the circumstances you are in. So, again, it's useful to remember that things are good up to a point, just like coal is good up to a point. Coal helped, the Industrial Revolution, and probably a lot of our living standards completely dependent upon coal. And yet we have now got to the stage where coal is effectively going to destroy us if we keep burning it. And especially if we keep burning it at an increased rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's a good example of one place where particularly I see a lot of polarization around this in various countries in the world, but the whole idea of renewable energy and climate change, and whether or not you believe that humans are contributing to it or not, of course, that's a huge debate that's going on. I think it's pretty obvious what most of us in the symposium are thinking in terms of that. But the question then comes up for me, are we possessed by the idea that we have to actually take these fossil fuels from the earth in order to continue our civilization in a way that is going to make us all happy and be pleasing and help everybody? Or is there a possibility that we can actually interrupt in some way that possession and change that? Do you think it's a possession, actually?
Well, I think it could be termed a possession. It's a kind of the idea that we have to develop in a particular kind of way, that, a good life is of a particular form, and that good life requires certain economic structures and actions and so on. And of course, in a way, it is a possession, but it's also a political possession. People who've actually benefit from the particular economic and energy structures that we have at the moment are threatened by an eruption, if you like, of the unconscious from the world. And so there is a tendency for those people to resist change and to promote, think tanks which argue that there is no global warming and all of that kind of stuff, and, to attack people and all of that kind of stuff, and to support political parties, no names mentioned, who, strongly campaign against global warming. Whereas one of my friends argues, and I think it's a really good argument, is that basically, if you put it in sort of domestic terms, if you kept fouling your room up all the time, shitting in the corner and pissing in it and stuff like that, it would be pretty foul and bad after a period of time. And yet here we are doing exactly that to the whole planet. People say carbon dioxide is not a poison. Well, okay, try living in a room that's 15% full of carbon dioxide and you will die. That's the end of it. And so, basically what we have here is the opportunity to make our planet more livable by ending the particular coal dependence that we have. Now, by all means, that I'm not saying we end today. That would be crazy. We couldn't do that. But we could certainly phase it out over the next 30 or 40 years, and we could certainly stop increasing what we are doing. But again, in a way that we are dealing with the political possession that refuses to actually acknowledge there is a problem because there is all these perceived advantages to the system that we have. And that's a kind of possession.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with you. And I want to just take a moment and acknowledge something that's happening for me right now, because as you began talking about the way that we are really defiling and abusing the earth, and gosh, the list of how we're doing that could just go on and on, because there's so many ways we're doing that. And we're all, I'm not, setting myself aside from that, or any of us, we are all
No, of course not.
that. We all live in cultures that burn fossil fuels and put pollution into the air, and we're all contributing through consumerism and various different ways to this. So it definitely is a collective problem, and it seems highly disordered. And so you've mentioned that term, and that was the other word that I wanted to say in the book that we talked about, that you mentioned in your bio. You can see my copy is quite worn. I've been such a huge fan of this book from the beginning, but depth psychology, disorder, and climate change. Why do you then continue to talk about disorder in all of this?
Okay, because I think disorder is a vital part of the world, right? I think that we have a tendency as humans, and particularly humans in our culture, to reduce everything to orderly patterns. And what that means is that the stuff that doesn't fit in with those patterns, we shove off to one side, we pretend doesn't exist, or we determine is pathological and we have a war against it, or something like that. And that means that we lose information. We don't come to understand the world because we say, oh, that's just disorder, let's not bother about it. Our nice orderly patterns are what we want. We want more order. But what I've been sort of suggesting is that in some ways, the more order you have, then the more disorder that you create, because the world actually resists your attempts at ordering. The world is incredibly complicated, and human abilities to understand are incredibly limited. So in any particular circumstance, you are always creating disorder through your order. And in this way, we could say, for instance, that disorder is the unconscious. Disorder is the disruptor of our lives. Disorder is the thing that provokes fear and impatience, unease. People try desperately to tidy stuff up. But of course, as you know, once you've tidied stuff up, then it gets untidy again. And again, I'm not saying that you need to let your room get untidy. That would be counterproductive. But there comes a point at which tidiness takes up too much effort. It actually destroys your ability to be at peace in the environment. But not doing any tidying also makes it impossible to live. So, you have to have this. So I talk about the order-disorder complex, because some order provokes disorder, and yet you need a degree of both, and you need attention to both. So, climate change in particular is a good example of this, as we've already kind of discussed. The order that we have, our economic order, the order of coal produces climate change. And it's not just coal, the order of concrete, all sorts of, the order of animal farming, they all produce greenhouse gases, and they all accelerate climate change. So, it becomes an issue of fear for us, because attacking the disorder produced by our order means that we can't actually just keep continuing the order, because it is the order that produces that disorder. So we actually have to think of something new. And that means that our own ways of living, our own ways of proceeding are actually disorderly, even though it appears that they are orderly to us. And that is terribly threatening. That's again why I say it's an existential crisis, because your mode of making order in the world no longer works. And, this also happens for people who are opposed to climate change. They want to order the world in a particular way, and quite often they don't see how that ordering appears threatening to other people, or how it may not actually work, or it may have to produce. One of the projects that I'm trying to get going at the moment is to look at the disorders produced by renewable energies, so that we might actually be able to use renewable energies in a more productive way, rather than produce social disorders, which they do in some occasions, and often people don't take those disorders seriously. A particularly good example, I think, was that there was a small American town who had fields around them, 3/4 of the fields around them were filled with solar energy generators, okay? And the town said, we don't want to do any more solar energy, because, if we have too much solar energy, then we actually don't have anything else to do. All of our farms can't be run, and people mocked them. Okay, and I thought, okay, these people have a reasonable point. They already have 3/4 of the fields around them, apparently, I don't know for sure, full of solar energy. Why should it be 100% solar energy? You know, why can't we leave life for other things as well? And so, yeah, so basically, you know, I think that you always have to look for the disorder that you are producing yourself.
Yes.
And then, as we were suggesting earlier, not all disorder is harmful. And in fact, kind of major Earth systems like evolution depend upon disorder. I mean, evolution depends upon mutations happening, which is a disorderly process. It depends upon creatures not surviving, which also might be considered a disorderly process from their point of view. It depends upon ecological disruptions happening, which happen all the time, so that no creature can ever become, you know, totally in control of its environment, because when it does that, it disrupts the environment and the evolutionary process starts all over again. You know, it's a major feature of our life, and I just don't think that we pay enough attention to it.
Yes, absolutely. And what you're bringing up too, what occurs to me is that you are talking about, on some level, you're talking about balance, and an inherent balance that absolutely is in place and needs to be constantly kind of restoring itself. So it's also an innate kind of intelligence that's in the universe itself. It's an innate ordering process that is constantly at work, creating either order or disorder, but as needed.
Yes.
So that brings me to the whole idea of complexity theory, which you mentioned in passing a bit before with Jung and then with Bateson. Can you say more about how depth psychology relates to that sort of complexity theory and how it all applies to climate change?
Okay. Well, basically, complexity in systems theory is a fairly simple idea. It just basically says that systems involve items or processes which interact with each other and modify each other. Okay, and they can either be fairly simple or they can be fairly complicated. An interaction between two people having a conversation sets up a system. I attempt to modify you, you attempt to modify me in some kind of ways. And, you know, if we actually have a good process going, then we both learn from this. We don't end up the same as when we started the conversation. Okay, so you can think of a psyche itself as being a system, which I think Jung did. And you have an ego which looks out on the world and attempts to order that world and attempts to order the inner world. I mean, you know, all of us think things like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling that, or I should be feeling this. And we attempt to control our emotional process. We attempt to control sometimes our physiological process. So we are constantly acting against another, if you like, ordering process that's going on at the same time. So the world escapes our order, but nevertheless we have to put our order on it, and that is a continually interactive process, right? So it circles round, hence the hand gestures. So in Jungian theory, Jung talks all the time about the unconscious as being compensatory. Okay, so it's compensatory to the limits of the ego. It seeks the balance that you are talking about, which is usually in systems theory is called homeostasis. Okay, now the thing that complexity theory brings to this is to suggest that in a complex system, which basically means a system of sufficient complication where things are modifying each other in response to events into the events of the system, that you cannot actually predict the results of what will happen in a complex system. Now, in reality, we all know this. You cannot predict what the result of a conversation will be. You cannot predict that you will not, under any circumstance, offend another person, even if you're trying not to. You may well do that. You know very well that in 10 minutes, the world may be completely different for you. You know, you may get hit by a meteorite, run over by a car. You don't know, okay? And yet we like to pretend that the world is completely predictable. Okay, but what complexity theory tells us is that it's not. And this refers to ourselves as well. We do not know what the results of self-work will be. We would like to think that we can perhaps predict the trend, And that is an important distinction to make between, for instance, you can say that the world will get warmer, that the global ice caps will melt, that sea level will rise and so on, but you cannot predict the weather in a particular place in 5 years' time, right? Because it's a complex system. And sometimes scientists have made the mistake of saying something like, oh, Sydney will have droughts in 10 years' time continually. But they actually can't say that. Sydney's weather will be different. We can predict that it's likely to be far more unstable than it is now. And it probably will be warmer, but we can't actually predict the details. And that's an important thing to do, because, you know, and basically also all I would say is that, you know, human beings are themselves complex systems embedded in social systems, which are complex systems, in family systems, which are complex systems, in ecological systems, which are complex systems, in a global system, which is a complex system. And so that means that, in fact, if you believe that order means that you can actually predict what is going to happen, the world is inherently disorderly. It will always escape your predictions. And the best you can do is using a sort of Taoist metaphor, is that you can tack against the wind and possibly get where you want to get. But you're not sure about that. You know, you still have the world in a way interacting with you, and that will have unintended effects. And so, you know, what I always say is that life involves a process of adjustment and adaptation, and always will do. And it's vital to remember that. That is again why I'm saying, you know, you can't just say, oh, if we replaced everything by renewables, then we would have solved the problem. We might well have solved one problem, but we might have created a whole heap of different problems. And it might also mean that we ignore heaps of other problems because we've just focused on renewables. As I was saying again earlier, you know, one of the major sources of greenhouse gases is the concrete industry, so the building industry. And, you know, if we have increased population, then we will have more and more building. And so that will also produce effects. So we have to work in all kinds of fields simultaneously. And that's kind of what complexity theory teaches us.
Yes.
It also teaches us, again, the important principle that you can never tell whether a small change will have a large effect or not, which is, again, another good reason for thinking that even the small changes that you do, which don't seem to have any rational means at all of having an effect on the world, you actually do them because they might.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
But again, you look to see, are they actually having the effects you want, rather than, say, making the people who are opposed to you even more intensely opposed to you, or
right.
whatever.
Right. And what occurs to me too is, of course, there's this whole idea of feedback loops, which I'm sure you can speak to way more than I can. But particularly in the topic of climate change, there seems to be these cycles where the more something happens, then the more something can happen, and that's absolutely unpredictable. Like the more the ice caps melt, then the less ice there is that's actually absorbing the sunlight, and then therefore the faster and more.
Reflecting the sunlight, to be precise. But
thank you.
But I mean, I think that is a very important thing. Is that that's what systems theory teaches you, is that you always have to look out for feedbacks. Mm-hmm. And that, in fact, you know, there's the whole tipping point thing, which also comes out of systems theory and complexity theory, where basically, again, things can seem stable for a long, long time, and then suddenly there comes a point where the accumulated change is so great that you shift to a completely new set of variables and a completely new system. And so anything that you've known about the old system is almost no longer valid. Mm-hmm. Yes. Because everything is new. Yeah. And that is one of the things that many climate scientists fear, is that we will shift into one of those rapid changes, and we perhaps will not be able to get back
to recover,
no matter what we do. So that's why you have to act in advance. And it's also, of course, why it's very difficult to persuade people, because, you know, they see things being relatively stable and they say, well, there's no need for rapid change of what we do. But the point is that accumulation will produce, or is likely to produce, the rapid change in the world, which, you know, will then require enormous changes in us, in our behavior.
Yeah. Now, if there's anything that's actually good about this, it is that in addition to feedback loops happening in the natural world that we can see out there,
Yeah.
it also can happen in the unconscious, because
Yeah,
the
sure.
unconscious is completely ecological in the same way, where everything is connected. So
Yeah.
something might occur very suddenly, and probably you've had that experience. I know I've had that experience where things absolutely changed in an instant. And
Yeah.
you know, there are other ways of knowing than just learning from a book in a linear fashion where you read one page after another.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I mean, that again is one of those things that the more that people actually understand the reality of life, if you like, the more it is likely that they will change. And then, of course, that will produce change in other people, because human beings are very emulative. We learn very easily from other people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
if somebody else seems to be balanced, then we usually like to learn from them.
Yes. Yeah.
It kind of rubs off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we're, I suppose that's what we're all hoping for on some level. And yet again, we have really no control over that. But creating these kinds of situations where that kind of shift or sudden change in a particular pattern can happen is actually very valuable if you're paying attention to that thing.
Yeah. And that involves a change of ego, which is why it's good to talk about ideas, because basically the ego uses ideas to think and to see the world.
Right.
And so often if you can change a person's ideas, then their ability to deal with what was previously unconscious is completely different.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I would completely agree with that. And so moving a little bit more into the climate change and the depth psychology piece of things, you have referred to the fact that climate change phenomena and depth psychology look somewhat similar to you. Can you say more about how that is?
Okay, well, again, if you think of the world as a vast complex system, right, and human beings also as being a particular complex system, again goes back to the way that you attempt to control or to order that world. Okay, we attempt to order our inner psyche, and that produces the unconscious, which then attempts to communicate to us, which presents dreams, disruptions, discomforts. Some people say even illness. Okay, I don't know whether that's true or not. But the same happens in the world. We go out and we try to impose our orders on that world. So we create an unconscious in that world, which is continually trying to communicate with us. So in a way, we personally are obviously not responsible for bad weather events, but we as a group are responsible for the weather events that come in to tell us in a way. I mean, they may not be, I'm not saying that they're intentionally trying to tell us, but they are information. And we can either say to ourselves, those weather events are just disorderly, of no interest to us, or we can say, hey, those weather events are actually information that we can use to try and understand what's going on, that we don't actually have to keep, if you like, suppressing the biological systems on Earth anymore, or the geological systems or whatever. We can actually, in a way, climate change is a call for us to learn about the Earth in a way that is different from previous ways that we've learned about the world. So, and that, because of the way that we are, whenever there are climate events, they are also symbolic events. Because we think in terms of things like storms and so on. We can say that someone, there's an internal storm. We can say that someone feels frozen. We use kind of weather attempts, or, that was a blustery conversation, or they're all just wind or whatever, so we think about these things in terms which are relevant to us. And so they speak to us whether we want to or not. So there's a way that we can, if you like, think of what we perceive in the world as a dream, and we need to interpret that world so that we can actually get closer to what the world is, so that we can strip away more of the preconceptions that we bring to the world and actually learn about the world more directly. And I think that's an important thing. Again, this is not kind of like it's humans versus the world, which is kind of a sort of dialectical position, just saying that there's the binary. But what it's saying is that there's humans and there's lots of other things and lots of different humans. There's a whole multilectical process going on, whereby there's whole heaps of different stuff being communicated, okay? And that's very complicated to resolve. But nevertheless, it means that, again, we need to pay attention to the world. We need to pay attention to the kinds of knowledge we have about that world. And so in a way, we construct a kind of depth ecology, where we're looking for what the ecology means for us, and we're also looking for how it is that we can best deal with, adapt to, and cultivate in the sense of an artistic cultivation or whatever, the world itself, so that we can all be happy in the world, and that includes the world as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's an important sort of thing too. And what I hear you saying is that on some level, there is this narrative that we're all living as human beings. There's a story that we're living out, that we're buying into, that seems like the reality of what it is that we have. And part of that is this whole binary that you talked about, how human beings are separate from the world around us, when indeed what we need to be looking for, and the new narrative that we somehow have to find a way to be weaving together, is that we are just a part of the world around us, and only one part, by the way, right? Not the most important part.
Yeah, and we are an emergent part, okay? Everything is an emergent part because it is always changing in relationship to other things. And, human being systems are evolving. Okay, they're evolving probably so slowly for us that we can't see them, but we are changing in response to the world. And the world continually permeates us. I can't remember what it is, but like a huge amount of our body is other bacteria and other life forms which are actually living in symbiosis. So we're not even a separate organism. Even some people say that even our cells, the mitochondria, are other kind of creatures which live in those cells. We are in some ways a rampaging colony, and that, again, I'm saying the rampaging because I don't want people to think that kind of we're like a colony where there's a head that tells everything else what to do. That's a completely wrong conception. Everything is speaking to everything else. And, even if the head is the most important part, you still have to engage in dialogue with the rest of your body and engage in dialogue with the rest of the world. And one of the things I say frequently, which may or may not be true, is that basically, if you suppress your body, then you are likely to suppress the world, and vice versa. So by suppressing the world, you're partially killing yourself.
Well, there's something about that, John, that really resonates with me when you say that. So I do think that there's some truth to that. And again, that's such a depth psychological way to look at things. So speaking of the body, that kind of brings me to a new place in our conversation, and that is some of what we've talked about has been then about that narrative. You made reference early on to how we feel like we have to continually, I don't know if this is the way you put it, but it's the way I took it, continually be making progress. Like we always have to be progressing. That's kind of our narrative for the collective culture.
That's our cultural narrative, yes.
Yes, it is. And are we disordered in that thinking? Is it a possession that's actually making us think that way? I don't know. I guess we don't need to necessarily split hairs about that. We've kind of addressed that already, but I'm wondering where I'm going with this is I'm wondering what role technology plays in all of this. This is something that is a fascinating topic to me, and I'd like to hear your impression of how it fits in.
Okay. First of all, I just like to respond a little bit to what you just said, and that's the idea of progress, okay? Because I think there are many ways that people can progress. Okay, for instance, in Buddhism, the idea of progression is different from in Western culture. Okay, obviously we now share a fair bit together because we insert it. So what I'm saying is that there's a particular kind of idea of progress, which I call developmentalism, for want of a better word, which is very much into the idea that economics is vital and it's absolutely the only important thing to do, and that that if you make more money and if you actually indicate that you are progressing by controlling the world and by spewing out more and more gas and stuff like that, that's developmentalism. Okay, it's a bit of, obviously in this space, and that's a caricature, but nevertheless, that's not the only form of progress. So, I think it's often useful to separate the idea of progress from our particular developmentalist part of thing. Okay, so to get back to technology, I think technology is intimately connected and mythically connected to Western ideas of developmentalism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, partly this is because the whole idea of Western development grew up with the growth of the coal engine, the steam engine, and so on. I mean, obviously, we can say it was built on slave trade as well, but the West wasn't the only set of countries in the world that used the slave trade in a big way. But what happened when we started using coal was a radical change in the way that work was organized, in the way that class and status were organized. It really radically altered what the way of life. Okay, and that's a really big break. And again, we got to say that a lot of this was good. Okay, we have better medical technology now than we used to have. You're more likely to live longer. People have access to each other across the world because of these technologies. You know, there are lots and lots of good things, and it's kind of fatal to pretend that all technology is bad technology. Okay, but it is connected to our views of the future, and it seems to be a force in its own right. So it's kind of a fantasy to begin with. You know, people write about technology as if it's enormously liberating, or as if it somehow destroys your soul. There's no kind of halfway point in most of Western writing about technology. And again, this demonstrates that it's a fantasy. And part of this is kind of inevitable, because whenever we think of the future, because we can't predict it, because the future involves complex systems, we are always thinking in terms of fantasies. We are imagining the future from our position as we imagine it to be now. So, you know, and the future will always inevitably disrupt that imagining. But because of this, sort of the nature of the imagining in the way that we use it, technology is always tied up with our visions of the future. Okay, you won't find a book about the future which does not have something to say about the consequences of technology. Okay, it's that important. So technology serves a kind of way of, if you like, progressing, and it also serves as a way of compensating and protecting yourself. Okay, because that's what fantasies do for us. So I think it's often useful to look about how the technologies function in that sort of way. For instance, I've just sort of published a paper on carbon capture and storage in Australia. Okay, carbon capture and storage is the idea that, in fact, if we can capture the emissions from coal burning then and store them underground, then we will no longer have a problem. We can keep burning coal for as long as we like. And of course, it's a popular idea because it means that people in the coal industry and people in the coal-powered industry don't actually have to change anything. All they have to do is get these carbon capture and storage going. Okay, so the question becomes, okay, what then happens? And what happened in Australia, as far as I can tell, is that the idea of carbon capture and storage became really important. But actually doing any research into carbon capture and storage was kind of minimal. So we have a situation in which the great solution to our problems was promoted, but nothing was done, or very, very, very little was done. Certainly not in anything like the amount of work or rigor that we need to actually use this thing. I don't think it worked anyway, but that's not the point here. The point is that it wasn't done. Okay, and there was heaps of money available for it. A lot of it wasn't used. And so in a way, that technology becomes technology becomes a fantasy of defense. It becomes a way that a group protects itself against having to change while announcing it is changing and feeling good about itself and so on. And so that's one example of a technological thing. And the other thing that we tend to do about technology is we tend to say that technology will have a particular effect because of its inherent nature. Whereas in fact, technology is always used by humans, and it's always used by social humans. And there's always a politics of technology. People try and use technology to gain particular ends. It may disrupt those ends, and then they adapt to it again. Processes of design are political. There's always kind of like, okay, what are we going to make, are we going to actually have steam engines that explode all the time, or are we actually going to make it illegal for steam engines to explode, or whatever? And that actually was a problem in America, I believe, because ferry boat, those big Mississippi boats were always exploding until they decided, well, no, it probably wasn't a good idea. So we always, again, cannot just separate technology from the social world, and obviously we can't separate technology from the social ecological world, and we can't separate technology from our Anthropocene world now either. All of this is interconnected, and it is in some ways driven both by our fantasies and by the consequences of our fantasies, which again gets back to the depth ecology stuff, in that you have to look at what are the unintended effects of this technology. And as I was saying with CCS in Australia, the unintended effects might be that nothing is done.
Right, unfortunately, or
well, fortunately, as the case might be. But so in a way, technology is a fantasy whereby we pretend we are not in complex systems.
Right.
Even though every engineer would tell you that you are.
Right. And there's no way to escape it. And it's a bit like, I think as we come to a close here, I'll just say, it occurs to me that, we are in those complex systems, whether it's in technology or whether it's in the natural world. We are absolutely embedded in those, and every single thing that we say, think, do, every action that we make, it's all going to have an effect somewhere else in the system. If we make any move whatsoever, or if we remain still. So,
indeed, that's the point, that in a way that whatever you do is a form of activism.
Right.
So, you may as well try and actually do stuff which appears to be useful to the
generative
world.
And positive.
Yeah. And I think there's been a long strand in depth psychology going back, to Wilhelm Reich and so on. But basically, part of the things that suppress us are the systems that we live within. So consequently, we have to work with those systems to change them, to be able to change the way that we live. And if you don't, and I think any psychologist will tell you, or a psychotherapist, that sometimes you have to get a person out of a family, for instance, for them to be able to change, because the family will try and keep the person where they are. I mean, not deliberately, not maliciously or anything like that. But to maintain their system, they will not allow something to change. So sometimes you actually have to go out and, be the change, if you like, and make the change, so that you can actually live a productive, useful life, harmonious life, shall we say.
Well, from your mouth, as they say, we have our work cut out for us, that is for sure. And,
sure.
It's an absolutely fascinating topic. And however, talking with you, it does give me hope, because when you start to see how all those parts work, I begin to see how that there's a way through this, if we're each conscious of what it is that we're doing, and we make decisions based on that consciousness, and presumably with, a greater good in mind. So it's been...
And we pay attention to the unconscious and to the disorder that we ourselves generate. Okay, that's the vital thing. That's what we have to become conscious of.
Yes, in fact, yes, looking at those things that are marginalized, typically at the margins of things and underneath the surfaces, is so critical and so depth psychological. Is this what we're doing? Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. It's just been absolutely fascinating. I've been really just thrilled to be able to dig into this a bit with you. I've been talking with Dr. Jonathan Marshall, who is not only an anthropologist, but also, as you can see, has a very strong interest in depth psychology and Jungian ideas. So really grateful to have you be part of the program here.
It's been great.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And as part of John's offering, he's actually going to make an abridged version of that book that we talked about, Depth Psychology, Disorder, and Climate Change, available as a downloadable file. So you can find out more information about that by clicking on the link. And if you'd like to get in touch with John or know more about his work, you can actually find some of his work on academia.edu. Many of you will know that site. It's a scholarly site where people can post papers and essays that they've written. So that's under academia.edu/John Marshall, Jon, as in Jonathan.
Yep.
Thank you again, Jonathan.
Thank you very much.
For more information, visit www.depthpsychologyalliance.com.